The following program is a UWTV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. Violence is a pervasive force in today's world, but violence is not a new development. A contentious debate over the proper role of violence and aggression reshaped Victorian society in both Europe and the United States. In his newest book, The Cultivation of Hatred, cultural historian Peter Gay describes that struggle and how the outcome has changed our lives. A past winner of the National Book Award, Gay is Sterling Professor of History at Yale University. And welcome to Upon Reflection. What does a better understanding of this time that you know so well tell us about the time in which we live?
Well, perhaps less than we'd like to think in a way, because they were very different times, clearly.
Not that long ago, though.
It's not long. They're our great-grandparents, to be sure. We speak the same language, but we don't lead the same kinds of lives. So I don't know how many lessons can be learned. I certainly didn't write the book to impart any lessons, but I suppose the one thing that you can perhaps say we could learn is a realistic appreciation of what we're like as people. And this includes aggressiveness of some sort, not necessarily violence. It could be called more gently self-assertiveness, for example. And once we understand that, to do something about it. My favorite example, which appears in the book, is William James's famous lecture on the moral equivalent of war. What do you do once you are tough-minded about the human animal and say, that's what we're like, and let's not blink this just because we're being sentimental? Then perhaps what we can do, and he doesn't use the word sublimate, to sublimate these aggressive feelings into sports, into public service. Those are two examples that he uses. Now that might be something one could think about, but beyond that I think there's a great gulf between us and them, and that's the First World War itself. God knows, a very violent event. But I think that changed so much that in many ways we look back as though in some ways it was a very, very different period.
The Victorian time was marked by this tussle that you describe in one way as being between the promotion and the policing of aggression. And society was always going back and forth between those two.
Well, I think actually that is what made the writing of the book interesting to me, certainly, is that both these things happen at once. What happens, and I use the word neutrally, is that a society or a class, and I talk about the middle classes, give themselves permission to be feel superior, to be condescending, to exploit, or maybe at worst even exterminate, give themselves permission, for example, in the 19th century, what was called scientific racism. It wasn't very scientific, but it was certainly racism. But there was, they were highly appreciated anthropologists who said the races have not only different endowments, but some are superior to others, from which it follows that the so-called lower races could be freely dealt with brutally. Why not? And let's say, for example, European imperialism in Africa shows this, the sense that the natives are uppity, they seem to want their own way when they have no right to that, and we come and bring them civilization, So this kind of alibi, which is very much contested as everything else in the 19th century, is you could say that people get very aggressive about aggression, if you want to say that, some being very, very critical of it and trying to find ways of fencing it in. So just so, for example, these racists have their opponents who have no use for this, argue it's not scientific at all, and therefore not a justification for any kind of behavior that we would today regard as very aggressive indeed. And on the other side, therefore, there's the question, how do you harness these forces? And you do it by ritualizing them or by inventing rules for them.
So it's not just that there was ambivalence about aggression, because probably people have always been ambivalent about aggression, but it was it was sort of the lengths to which the rationale was developed to say, well, aggression is just part of life.
It's part of life, but the question is, how far are we going to push it? What will we permit and what will we not permit? Well, this is one of the reasons I spend some time in the book on the rise of the umpire in sports. You know, the man who tells you this is unfair. You may not land a blow below the waist, or you will be penalized. You may not kick the opponent's shin in a soccer game, or you'll be thrown out of the game, and so on. This is really a modern invention, and I think largely a Victorian invention.
One of the examples that you use in the book, in fact, it's a fairly startling example that comes early on, is a kind of duel, a very ritualized duel that you use as a metaphor for the time called a mensur. Can you talk about the mensur?
Well, that was a pseudo-aristocratic notion defending the idea of manliness among students in German universities, also in Swiss universities. The German-speaking world specialized in that. Other countries did not have this particular form of madness, but anyway, the Germans did. It consisted of members of given fraternities ritually insulting one another. There were certain words that you used, and the other one would say, "Yep, exactly. I'll meet you at dawn tomorrow morning." These were very carefully arranged. The two battling one another, well, sometimes they used sharp swords and sometimes a little more flexible kinds of weapons, but they were also goggled and pretty much covered over, so that the death was a fairly rare exception. And when that happened, when somebody was killed in a student duel, then the universities got terribly nervous, enforced the rules which were there and were never enforced, because many of the professors had gone through the same damn thing. The idea was presumably to school one in coolness and manliness, to show that one could take pain, because it was not only that part of there was not very much left open to wound, but your cheeks, your forehead, your ears were normally free. And if you were wounded, and then what had to happen, according to the rules, was that you were supposed to be stoical, not flinch, and then the doctors would come running up with their rather filthy little swabs and swab the wound, making sure that it would not heal, because the desirable thing was to get what the Germans call the Schmiss, this rather, from our point of view, rather ugly, debilitating-looking scar, and this scar was regarded as socially extremely desirable.
So this is sort of an early and pretty brutal form of networking, really. I mean,
Absolutely.
these scars that these men carried out of these duels were part of the bourgeois society, and it was a sign that you had confronted your own frailty as a human being and proved yourself a man.
Well, yeah, this went along, of course, with other exercises and manliness, like drinking, you know, for example. And these drinking bouts used to be famous in university after university. But here you see already how aggression works in both ways. On the one hand, it's fostered, it's encouraged. The student is supposed to do it if he belongs to that kind of fraternity. They didn't all do that. In fact, quite a few students went through German universities and never saw a duel and had no use for it in any case, or couldn't afford it, because the fraternities were pretty expensive. But on the one hand, you foster it. On the other hand, you control it by seeing to it that people do not get killed, by also doing it as secretly as possible, not to get the kids involved with the authorities and so on. So both things happen together.
In describing the mensur, you quote from a man who witnessed one of these actually several of these battles, a man named Jerome K. Jerome. And in the book you say, with your tongue sort of in cheek, the way that he secured his audience was by first warning them away, saying this is very violent and might be too disturbing.
Well, that's also, of course, a teacher's trick. You know, you say, you don't want to take this course because it's there's a lot of very difficult stuff in it and very hairy stuff, and if you're sensitive, you may not want to do this. Jerome was interesting to me because he was an English visitor, and the English, on the whole, did not believe in duels, not even among grown-ups, and he reports what it was like to watch this. And what is so very interesting is that he starts out worried whether he's going to get sick watching this nonsense. Secondly, as he moves on and he describes very graphically what he calls the hot odor of blood in the room and the smell of beer and the conviviality of the students all cheering on their particular boy. He says, well, then I felt sorry for these fools to do this. And at the end, as the afternoon wears on, he discovers he likes it. And the key sentences, as he admits, he says, I wanted more. I said, you see, he may be an Englishman, but he's also human. You know?
That was a fascinating passage that he went through of becoming acclimated to violence, and it did raise questions to me about people who say, well, it's great for people to watch violence because then, you know, they're used to it and et cetera, et cetera. But it seemed in him, in his descriptions, to whet his appetite for it, which is something quite different.
Well, you know, he was being honest, which is fairly rare. I mean, he was reporting about something he was not proud of. In fact, he said, I thought I should show how rotten I can be just because the mensur made me, brought out in me all these most unpalatable feelings. He incidentally, in his autobiography written in the 1920s, he talks about the First World War and the outbreak, and how at the very beginning he also has these beastly feelings. You know, this is a sporting event, the more Germans we kill, the better off we'll be, and so on, and then gradually feeling this is really not a civilized way to be.
Let's talk a bit about how the forces that brought these men together in these duels were more generalized in institutions in the society itself, and talk about how this tussle over how to best manage aggression manifested itself, for example, in business and industry.
Right. Well, here in business industry, you have, of course, one of the great alibis of the century, the idea that in the marketplace as elsewhere in life, you ought to fight like hell, and the better man will win, and competition, therefore, is the only possible, legitimate, shall we say, natural way in which the economy can work. One of the ironies about this, by the way, is that one of the leading and most articulate social Darwinists, because that's where this came from, really, Andrew Carnegie, who wrote quite a bit in some influential articles, who fostered all of this in theory, of course, in practice, tried to eliminate competition as much as he could. But that's one of the ironic sidelights of this. But once again, it gets complicated. Someone may be in favor of completely unhampered free enterprise on grounds that appear to him to be scientific. But then, on the other hand, when certain things get carried beyond what he can decently defend, then he begins to pull back. I'll give you one example of this. William Graham Sumner, who, you know, the old Yale economist who went around preaching the state has no business helping the poor and the sick, and that millionaires are really wonderful people. They take care of all of us. But when things got aggression and got pushed too far, as far as he was concerned, he checked out. And one example was the Spanish-American War. On the grounds, by the way, of kind of sporting attitude, that it was not sporting for a great power, rich and very much becoming a central figure in world diplomacy of the United States, taking on a ridiculous, decrepit empire, the Spanish, which would never have a fair chance. So this is almost like someone saying you don't want a heavyweight fighting, you know, a welterweight, because it's not fair. So sometimes people whom you would expect to be simply aggressive all the way through turn out to turn around at some point, saying, this far I don't want to go.
In addition to the heightening of competitiveness, there was also a tendency towards specialization, something that we certainly see carrying through into our time. Was that part and parcel of this same debate, the specialization of professions?
Well, it's part of a debate, but that debate probably is not so vigorous as some of the others because the facts were just unanswerable, you know. The idea of the Renaissance man, that famous ideal, the person who could do anything, be a professional and in his whatever he does and does it well, be a courtier and a painter and a great conversationalist and so on. This ideal was fading, and ironically, it's curious that early in the 19th century, Goethe, of all people, who was a true, you know, Renaissance man, said, the end has come. We can no longer do this. His metaphor was, let us learn to play our instrument, and that one instrument, and then play in the orchestra of humanity.
Everybody had their inconsistencies.
Right. Well, on the one hand, he could do the things he thought could no longer be done, and that would be inconsistent. But he was quite right about specialization. And that certainly takes over as the 19th century goes on.
And this was also the time of the Industrial Revolution and the mechanization of business and industry.
Yeah. And by the way, what I talk about when I talk about aggression and its possible control of cultivation, you see, of course, working itself out in the economy all the time. And
what about politics?
Politics. Well, again, you have, I don't know whether I specialize in contradictions, but what you have is very, very contradictory developments. On the one hand, you have the great democratization of politics, bringing in more and more people into the political process, which simply means voting, essentially. And it also means, of course, voting on the basis of some information, or as much as you can get, from a relatively free press. And this really is a development that moves, although against a great deal of resistance, across the century. But there's lots of resistance. For example, should women be given the right to vote, right? In 1848 at Seneca Falls, the famous feminist convention put the demand for the vote for women as a kind of an afterthought. It was very bold. And by the end of the century, only a few states in this country, like Colorado, for example, and some of the outlying countries such as Australia had women voting, and in England and Germany, it was not until after World War I. So when I say there's a broadening out, a democratization of politics, first of all, against, as I say, a lot of resistance, against certain groups joining the political public, which is the right to vote being the central emblem of this. But also there's something else that goes along with that, and that is continual attempts by state after state, not all states, but say France, for example, to checkmate this development. For example, by means of introducing press laws that prevent political criticism from being free or at all effective and so on, or manipulating the electorate, so that you get a kind of weird, again a contradiction if you wish. There are certain more or less demagogic statesmen, if that's the right word here, if that's not an oxymoron, like Napoleon III and to some extent Bismarck, who proposed universal manhood suffrage. That's every male over 21 vote. The idea there was that the masses are rather so dumb and so subservient that they'll be good conservatives, which was a gamble that did not work.
So nothing really moved in lockstep in this time
No.
at all. There were great differences on every issue between different parts of Europe, and certainly between Europe and the United States.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that in some ways the United States and Britain have a fair amount in common, not only divided by a common language, but perhaps united by these political developments. I mean, this country, the 1840s, 50s, are the times at which more and more males, at least, are brought into to the political public and to vote.
One more institution to take a look at, and maybe this one will be more clear-cut, and that's the entertainment of sports.
Well, I hate to say this, but
Not
I
true.
see again. Well, it's true in part, but what you can say about sports is that in some ways it's a great disappointment to those who think that violence, aggressiveness can be curbed by translating barroom brawling with a
Sort
fair
of
fight.
sublimating the...
Yes, right. Now, it starts out pretty well, if you wish. Take the favorite sport, not in this country yet, or perhaps never, but certainly in Europe, namely soccer, or football. Now, that came out of boys' schools in England, who, and the really good soccer players, when they, as it were, grew up, more or less, and went to the universities, wanted to go on with this game. And so in the 1850s and 60s, they developed common rules. What is fair, what is unfair? How large is the goal allowed to be? How many men on each side? What is offside? And all these other rules, as I said earlier, are developed then. But then gradually what you get, and then along with this, I should say, runs the hope that this will actually reduce pugnacity by having outlets which are so peaceful and enjoyable as an afternoon of sports, and one party wins, the one side wins, the other loses. But then gradually it turned out that this wasn't quite so, partly because it became more and more of a spectator sport, and the spectators wanted more trouble rather than less.
One of the interesting contradictions in this book was, especially when you were looking at sports, how the working classes sports were called rough entertainments, and yet something like the mensur, which was more bloody and more violent, was seen somehow as some exercise in nobility, some aristocratic exercise.
Well, in a way, the mensur, to come back to that, is a kind of imitation aristocratic exercise. It seemed the early history of that particular strange cultural custom is still shrouded in darkness, but most of the students who did hack away at each other were, in fact, middle-class kids, the sons of professors, the sons of businessmen.
Kind of a strange way of having upward mobility.
Well, yes. Sometimes it was downward, of course, also.
Now, you talked about the emergence of the umpire in sports, this person who would police the action, so to speak, and that is almost a metaphor for this enormous advice industry that also blossomed in this time. It seemed like everybody wanted to be a regulator of behavior.
Yeah, and what is interesting, I mean, the varieties of advice that people were giving were enormous, but I think there is one key element that runs through most of it, and that is control yourself. Don't get mad. Or if you get mad, don't act. Don't mail that letter, wait till the next day. Remember that rage makes you look ugly, and so forth and so on. Nearly all of it has to do with the control of the emotions.
One of the most amusing titles of one of these advice books from the time simply called Better Not.
Right. This, of course, also means better not drink, better not engage in illicit sexual activity, and also better not get mad so that other people can see you in this disgraceful state. Yeah, it's a lot of that.
Now, if you had taken your lens as a cultural historian and shifted it to other continents in this same time period, would this same debate have been going on in other cultures, in Asia, in Africa, as you see in Europe and the United States?
I there have to plead ignorance. I'm happy to know a certain amount about Europe and this country, and I wouldn't want to, say, talk anthropology. I know, I do reading in it. It's interesting enough to see anthropologists arguing about the very same question: how aggressive or how passive are certain, or pacific are certain so-called primitive cultures. But I did not do that. I confined myself to what seemed to be plenty of an assignment, and I wouldn't want to generalize simply because I just don't know enough.
Let me ask you another question that may be hard to answer, and that is, do you think that we're any more aggressive now than the people that we've been talking about were in Victorian times?
Well,
has the level of aggressiveness risen?
You know, you can't quantify this very well. I mean, crime statistics, to take one example, are notoriously unreliable. Sometimes there seems to be more when there isn't, but there's better reporting. What I think I can say, having thought about this a little bit, is that the 19th century, however much it ended in war and however many wars there were, like, say, the very bloody Civil War here, is a less violent century than ours. I think there's no question about that. And from that point of view, there's a certain regression from the civilized ideal, which was only partially realized in the 19th century, but seemed at least possible. You know, I think people were not every, again, you get much debate, but people were relatively hopeful that there were certain kinds of aggressive feelings that were part of a barbarous past that would not be kept up in these civilized times. But then again, of course, even in the 19th century, you have lots of examples showing it's not so. There are those who say anti-Semitism is simply a legacy from a more primitive past, at the same time that anti-Semitism becomes more virulent. So once again, I find it very hard to draw any conclusions. But I do think that if you look simply at the record, the number of victims, the number of refugees, you are, I think, in a very fair way of saying that, you know, the theory of progress does not make too much sense.
Does that have anything to do with war? I mean, you see the First World War as, if you look at Victorian times as a kind of boiler, which is an image that appears from time to time, and pressure builds and builds and builds, and the First World War or the Civil War, kaboom, lets all of that pressure off.
Yeah, well, the one thing I do not want to say is that even though I end with the First World War, and so dramatically with August 4th, 1914, is that this was inevitable, that it was moving towards that inevitably. I think most historians are uneasy with the idea that things had to happen just because they happen in this way. And if some things had been a little different, then perhaps the history would have been a little different. War, of course, is important as a kind of the utter negation of the possibility of, being civilized with one another. If not only among the soldiers who have to kill one another, but among civilians. The First World War was a remarkable example of this.
The war to end all wars.
Well, that line came, of course, later. But what I had in mind was, say, professors turning back honorary degrees from now enemy countries is no longer worthy of your regard and admiration and so on. There was a certain amount of brutalization, even among the intellectuals, and why not? Certainly know better than most other people in this and other regards.
So there's some people look at the history of aggressiveness as a kind of continuum that rises steadily over time, but this book and what you just said, it's not that simple. There's cycles. It goes up and down. It takes sort of Hegelian spins even.
Yeah, right. Which of course means that the future is not predictable. I mean, I remember, speaking of predictions of this kind, that in the 1960s, some of the people I knew at Columbia University, whose job it was to think about American-Soviet relations, were utterly convinced on all logical and historical grounds that there would be an atomic war between these two powers. As you know, it hasn't happened. And that's always, I think, a good lesson to say, let's not predict too confidently, because there are so many variables always at work that we really cannot tell. Also, I mean, I think this steadily rising curve of which you speak is denied by the fact that the ancient world was immensely brutal. As a matter of fact, to come back for a moment to James's moral equivalent of war, of which I spoke earlier, he begins with talking about the Greeks and the Romans and how bloody all this was. And all you have to do is read the Iliad to see how pleasurable killing could be, or how necessary it appeared to be then.
My last question for you, it actually maybe seemed like a more theological question than a question for a cultural historian, but I'd be very interested in what you think about it. You say that aggression is such an engine of progress in history, that a good deal of progress comes out of this aggressiveness that we have. And I wanted to know if you thought that if you had aggression and you had kindness, or whatever the opposite of aggression is, have you seen from your, which is stronger? Which is a greater engine?
I'll have to cap out and say no doubt both are. I mean, I'm reminded of, Kropotkin, that gentle anarchist who said that cooperation is as important in evolution as conflict, and he makes indeed a very good case. When I speak of aggression as an engine, also an engine of progress, I mean, of course, not the kind of viciousness or absurdity that you get, say, once again in the Mensur, but really self-assertiveness, the desire to control and master the world without necessarily meaning by controlling and mastering doing others in.
But that debate is never ending. It will always be part of humanity.
I would think so. And as long as the debate goes on, we go on too, which is one encouraging thought.
Peter Gay, I want to thank you so much for being a guest on Upon Reflection, your newest book, The Cultivation of Hatred. Thanks again for being here.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.